Hey internet, as usual, I am in the car. I'm headed somewhere. It's about 4:25 or so. I am finally headed up to Main Gear Computers to pick up my new workstation, or as Reddit would call it, a battle station. So I gotta tell you, I'm pretty stoked. I'm not gonna get a chance to work with it right away. I'm gonna go up there, take a couple of pictures of it. They're gonna box it up. I'm going to take a couple photos sort of in Main Gear's environment real quick, and then they're going to box it up and I'm going to bring it back, drop it off at my studio, and then I have stuff to take care of for a while. And then overnight tonight I'll be working with it. I have to, move my current workstation over a little bit, put the new one in, move a couple of hard drives over, so it's going to be a little bit of an endeavor, but not a huge deal. But I got to tell you, I'm really stoked about this. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. I think what I wanted to take a minute and talk about with you guys in general sort of right now is if you follow my Instagram, what I'm trying to do in 2017 is do Instagram posts that have some small comment or saying that sort of reflects on the day, and original photography of my own in the backgrounds. Now, it's not going to be anything special. There's a lot of, landscapes and sunsets and sunrises so that I can kind of use them in generic ways. I'm sort of experimenting with that kind of semi-stock photography aesthetic for that stuff, honestly. But what I'm thinking is usually reflected a little bit in that day or something I'm trying to point out. And one of the things that I noticed is the last 2 days have been quotes by an author named Richard Bach. Now, Richard Bach most famously wrote a book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which was big when I was younger, kind of with the hippie crowd, but maybe not so much these days. They did a movie about Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and it's basically all centered around the life and times of a seagull. I mean, it's probably one of the few books you'll ever read that has a seagull as the protagonist and deals entirely with sort of seagull culture and uses that as a way to talk religion. And I actually came to Jonathan is the second book by Richard I had written when I was very much younger, when I was 13 or 12. A friend of a relative of mine gave as a gift to me a book called Illusions. Now, Illusions was also written by Richard Bach. It was kind of his follow-up to Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And Illusions is very based around, the subtitle is The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah, and it sort of tells the story of a guy, theoretically Richard Bach. It's written as a non-fictional first-person novel, who meets a gentleman who it turns out is a Messiah. I would hesitate to say the Messiah. It's not really a Christian book per se, but they go on to, have adventures, and the Messiah in this case spends some time bestowing philosophy upon the main character, and eventually he gives him a copy of something called the Messiah's Handbook, semi-ironically, which is this book that if you flip it open to any page and read any random word or sentence, there's something in it. There's a parable that's supposed to help you. And towards the end of the book, the Messiah mentions that you could do this with any book. It didn't need to be the Messiah's Handbook. And in fact, there's nothing special about the Messiah's Handbook that way. It's a very interesting novel. It really talks now about what we would term sort of the law of attraction or magical thinking, that idea that, what you put out into the universe comes back to you, and that, this sort of the life you're living now is intended to be almost a game or simulation. So if you imagine the idea that you have a spirit that's much larger than you're conscious of right now, that you then have chosen to live this life because you want to learn something. And obviously you don't have access to that higher spirituality, because if you did, then it would be very hard for you to learn the lessons you're trying to learn to now, because you would be omniscient and omnipotent, and obviously then there's no challenge. And the analogy in the book is that, to learn something from a movie, even though the movie is, not a real place, you sort of have to place yourself in the movie, and for that time you have to believe that the movie world is real, even though you know you could get up and walk out of the theater, and that if you don't make that connection, if you don't buy into that belief system of the movie, then you're not going to be scared, or you're not going to learn the lesson, you're not going to face the moral dilemmas, and it kind of goes on in that fashion about that sort of thing. Now, this never, that core spiritual concept never caught on with me. I've been an atheist essentially my entire life, and not only did, Catholicism not really catch me, but this sort of broader meta spirituality, law of attraction, universe stuff never really fit with me either. But that doesn't mean that the book didn't have an enormous amount that I took away from it. I took a lot of it away about personal responsibility and, limiting yourself artificially, because there's a lot in the book that talks about, the Messiah is attempting to teach our main character that he too can be the Messiah, and he argues with him all the time. He's, I can't do that, you can do that, you're special, and the sort of main character, Messiah character, is like, but I'm not any different than you. And so the book also works as a discussion of what, in a later book, a gentleman would talk about as resistance. If you've ever read a book a friend of mine introduced to me called The War of Art, where they talk a lot about this idea of resistance and internal resistance. And even when you know what you could be and what you want to be, and that you have all the tools, that somehow or another you'll still probably talk yourself out of believing that that's for you, or it refers to you, or it has anything to do with you. So I don't know, there's a lot to take away from it that way. Anyway, Illusions is a book that way, where if you're sort of spiritual, I think there's a whole other side to the book that you might find interesting or annoying or offensive, depending on how it meets with your spirituality. But the writing and the characterization and this sort of ability that book has to pierce through some of the bullshit is astonishing, and well worth the short read. It's a very short book, and the first 10 pages, 15 pages are actually written longhand in a sort of pseudo notebook style, and are themselves a parable for these small sea creatures. So it's kind of a weird book to jump into, but if you've never read it, I would strongly suggest you pick it up. Now, you could also go read Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which is essentially the story of a seagull who becomes a Messiah-like figure for other seagulls, and learns how to fly while he's asleep, and can, fly through things, and eventually ascends or whatever. You could go back and read Jonathan as well. It's a great piece of literature in itself. But really, if you read Illusions, what you're seeing is a more accessible and in many ways more direct exposition of the views and ideas that were in Jonathan Livingston Seagull, just as more of a novel with a human protagonist, which you might find it a little easier to connect to. In any case, both of those books are absolutely wonderful to read. And there have been, and I'm sure more quotes from Jonathan and or Illusions will creep into my sort of Instagram project over the year. But the two, the one I put up last night was a very classic one, and it basically says, argue for your limitations, and sure enough, they're yours. And that's very Hallmark cardy, which is why I kind of put it over this sort of sunset background, and there's a seagull in the background, which is sort of an allusion to Jonathan. But it's true. If you're involved in teaching people anything, or you're involved in mentoring, you know that there are people who, long after it's clear that they have the skills or they have the abilities that they need to pursue something, that they say is their goal, that people will just fight you. They'll fight themselves really hard to not do whatever that thing is that they want to do or say they want to do. And it's very easy to get frustrated and forget that you're human too, and that, you know, you have the same things, maybe just in different areas. But you start wondering whether it is just that, do they not want the thing they said they want? Or are they, you know, is their motivation not there? Because, I mean, look, just the thing is right there. Just do the thing. Just, you know, dive into the water, or dance with the girl, or ask that barista out, or, you know, try this, or get a new bicycle if you say you want to ride a bike every day, or whatever those things are. That it's very easy to question maybe their motives or their dedication to the process, because they're not doing what from the outside seems like the easiest and most obvious thing, which is to just do that thing that they say they want to do and that you're going to help them do. But it's not always that. There's a very human tendency, and it's a constant struggle for many people to deal with. And it's something, you know, I'm certainly not immune to too, where achievement would involve change. Achievement would maybe sort of betray all the resistance you had before. You know, let's say that you've spent your whole life afraid to talk to women. And let's talk about something from you know, an area that many men have trouble with. Let's say you've spent, you know, 25 years of or 10 years or 5 years of your life, and you're very shy, and you don't really ask women out. When, you know, there was this girl you really liked and you never asked her out, and then she started dating someone else and she moved on, and, you know, your only insulation from the belief that you should have done that you had a chance to do that at that time, is, I'm shy, I don't really talk to women. My self-definition now involves this idea that I don't talk to women very well, and there was this tragedy that I never dated that girl I wanted to date, but it's not really my fault because, you know, I'm just very shy around women. Or there was this job that you really wanted, but you didn't, you know, go and interview for it because you were afraid to go and do the interview, and now you're looking back on it and you know, you're like, oh, it turns out I don't do well in interviews, and I'm really shy about that. So that's why I didn't do the interview, because I have this problem that keeps me from doing it. And let's say later on in life, a year or two down the line, you meet someone who teaches you that, you know, you now could go talk to the girl, or go do the interview, or go travel if you had always been afraid of traveling. One of the things that you will resist learning that lesson, you'll resist breaking through that barrier, is because if it's easy, if it turns out that you could have done it before, you could have done it back in the day, that now that knowledge means that the problem back in the day was you, and that you are responsible for not getting that job, or at least not trying to get that job, and you are the person, it was your own internal resistance that kept you from asking that girl out. That you don't get to hide behind the fact that you're, you know, clinically shy, or that your, you know, dad didn't feed you the right kind of sandwiches, so, you know, of course you're not really good in interviews, or whatever. So even now, even later in life, when you have the opportunity to overcome that thing, and then have that skill for the future, to be able to talk to the next pretty girl you see, or go for the next job you really want, something about that, learning that skill now would in a way betray the story you've told yourself about what happened in the past. So you don't. You'll just continue to find reasons why you can't do that. And it's interesting when you look at what some of the great motivational gurus do. Tony Robbins does these all-day seminars, and other, you know, some people have you walk over hot coals, and other people have you, you know, go do other weird things. And there's a catharsis there. There's almost a need to treat those people as if they're gurus, and treat that experience as if it was a semi-religious experience, or an interventional, cathartic experience, because that's the thing that gives you permission to, you know, maybe gain that new skill, and still not have to have had that skill in the old days. If I can say, well, I can go for the next job interview because I spent 12 hours in a room with Tony Robbins pounding it into my head, and then I walked over coals and I had this almost mythical cathartic experience, and now from this moment forward I am capable of doing things I could never do in the past, and I was never able to do them. It's only now through the grace and guidance of Tony Robbins that I can move forward. Maybe that's the excuse you need. Maybe some of the reason why there's value in those cathartic experiences is because they can firewall you off from what you needed, from taking responsibility maybe for what you couldn't do before, or they give you a way to forgive yourself for what maybe you resisted doing in the past. And that's not to say that these things are being done nefariously. I think Tony Robbins is a brilliant man about human psychology, and I think if this is the case, if this is one of the reasons why those cathartic experiences happen, to give you permission to break with the previous you and move forward without going, well, now but if I go for my next job interview, then does that mean I could have gone for the last job interview? I think he might be constructing that experience deliberately, knowing that it's one of the things that will help you, and that though the catharsis might not be technically required, that it was something you maybe needed to have. And in other cases, there are obviously, real reasons for cathartic experiences, and they're not always like that, but I don't know. Anyway, I've been talking a lot about it over the last couple of weeks with a friend of mine, and the War of Art talks about this catharsis, this resistance concept a lot, and I think that's kind of what brought to mind, as always, Illusions, which is in its own way a book that's all about overcoming needless internal resistance around the idea that you're not special, or maybe you shouldn't have the thing, or maybe that's for other people, and whatever. So that's where that quote comes from. There's a previous quote the day before that that's a little more meta-spiritual, that still talks in nice ways about things that apply, even if as like myself, you don't really have a hugely spiritual bent. And to paraphrase it, it says, remember where you came from, where you're going, and why it is you got yourself into this mess in the first place. And there's something to be recognized in the fact that the circumstances we are in day to day are the circumstances that are the result of the choices we've made before this. So while things happen that are outside of our purview, and we're not responsible for all those things, we are responsible for a lot of the context and situations of our lives. Anyway, that is probably, I could go on about that forever, but let's kind of leave that there. Go ahead and read Illusions. Go ahead and read Richard Bach. And we'll be doing other book recommendations over the next week. So I'll give you a week to get through that. And then maybe next weekend we will talk in more detail about Foundation, or if we're thinking some sci-fi stuff. We have Fountainhead to talk about still in terms of Ayn Rand. We have Atlas Shrugged to talk about. And it's funny because Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged sort of make a Illusions, Jonathan Livingston Seagull-esque pair in their own way. All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead back to driving and do what I'm doing and go get this computer. I may jump on live after I get this computer and be like, oh my God, it's so awesome. But probably not today. Enjoy it. Take it easy, folks. And thanks for watching.